Welcome to Pennsylvania in Focus. I'm Cole McNeely. Joining me today is the Center Square's Pennsylvania reporter, Anthony Hennon. Anthony, you wrote a story this week on plugging wells. This is something that you and Kristen, who's typically the host, talked about a couple weeks ago. Plugging wells, there is a lurking taxpayer cost associated with this. What is the conversation surrounding plugging wells in Pennsylvania right now?
Yeah, so this is a long and old conversation concerning Pennsylvania's oil and gas wells. On Monday, the House Environmental Resources and Energy Committee held a hearing that was just focused on conventional drillers, which is generally shallower wells, vertically drilled down rather than these larger horizontal wells that are drilled through fracking. As is most commonly known, fracked wells are the majority now of natural gas production in the Commonwealth, but there's still, there's a number, thousands of vertically drilled conventional wells are still operating here. The problem is historically wells were drilled vertically. And so we have this environmental inheritance of uncapped, orphaned, abandoned wells that can cause environmental harm, can cause be health hazards to the public. So one of the things here that has bothered people is the well bonding requirements. When you hear from former officials from the Department of Environmental Protection, when you hear from environmentalist groups like the Sierra Club, they're arguing that the current standard is flawed here and that the bonds required for these wells are set too low. We heard from Kelsey Krebs, who's with the Sierra Club, who argued that current policies in Pennsylvania actively encourage operators of today to leave non-producing wells uncapped. Essentially, by having these low bonding requirements and not necessarily enough oversight, they argue, essentially operators can get away with just leaving these uncapped, and then that falls to the government to take care of.
Anthony, in recent years, state money in Pennsylvania and federal money both have increased to try to plug these wells.
Yeah, so this has been something that's been gaining steam in recent years, especially from some major federal laws that have been passing. Pennsylvania is looking, I believe, over the next few years, somewhere in the neighborhood of about $50 million or so the next couple of years to plug some of these wells. The problem here is when you're capping these wells to make sure they're not leaking anything out into the environment or anything like that, these are not new wells. These are not wells generally that have been drilled within recent decades. Some of these date back to, post-Civil War, 1870s, 1880s. Some of these are back, pre-World War I. And those tend to be trickier to deal with because you have to go in there, you have to clean out the wells of any detritus in there, you have to go in and cap them, do all this stuff. So, ideally, when the DEP has looked at this in the past, we're talking a cost of an average $30,000 maybe, sometimes less. But some of these trickier wells can go, more than $100,000, more than $200,000 to fill. So the concern here is that the government is taking care of these more expensive ones when there are some out there that we could still trace back to current operators.
You mentioned all these time periods in history, and a pretty important one for this conversation is 1984. What is the significance of the year 1984 when it comes to this conversation about plugging wells?
Yeah, so 1984 was essentially when the state required bonds to be taken out for drilling these new wells. And this is also a point of contention here for conventional operators, where they argue that when you're looking at this, the vast majority of these wells are being orphaned or left alone. They were drilled pre-1984. So even if you would increase bonding, that's not really affecting in these wells. What is happening is that you're putting more of a burden on these smaller operators that could push them out of the market altogether. There's also the argument we heard from Arthur Stewart, who runs Cameron Energy Company, who is a conventional driller. He points out that his own company has filled hundreds of these wells or capped hundreds of these wells themselves because when they're buying land, they're going out and they're looking before they drill anything new. They're looking for old wells. And when they find these wells, these get reported to the DEP and then they get capped. But the problem is when they report these wells to the DEP, it looks like it's the operator who found them is one who caused it. And it's kind of shirking the duty here. So Stewart phrased this as the freedoms and infrastructure we enjoy today were built with energy from orphaned wells dating, back to the Industrial Revolution, World War I. And he says, in that sense, we all profit from our forefathers' legacy, and we all share that legacy's responsibility. So Stewart was essentially trying to make this argument here that, conventional operators are operating in good faith. When they find these wells, they report them and fill them, and just framing this as a current problem rather than an inherited problem. doesn't really give you a fair picture of what's happening.
Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com. For Anthony Hennon, I'm Cole McNeely. Please subscribe, and thanks for listening.